Okay, welcome back to our interview with George P. Fanala. And it's the story that we were broadcasting earlier, and this is part two. And this is From Here to Hell and Back Again about the corruption of a state hospital. And a little story that I wanted to pull away from part one before we interview and bring in George P. Fanella from Globe, Arizona. George had grown up in Western Pennsylvania, and his mother may have had what we call today an adulterous affair with a doctor. And it sounds to me from the whole story that George's dad was falsely imprisoned in a state hospital. And if you know anything about the state prison system, that today, by today's standards, you can get paid. Well, George's dad did not. George's dad was treated like a white slave in a system in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Today, what we had the opportunity to do is we wrote letters and talked to the state representatives and also wrote and talked to the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. And before I interview anybody, I wanted you to know that there's substance to this story. Because when George tells you what he wants to accomplish from this, he's going to say it in his own words. And I'm going to introduce and welcome George in from Arizona. Hi, George.
Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing good. I'm much better that you're here. And you're going to pretty much start off where the journey begins at the Justice Department and how to clean up corruption that happened to your
Yeah.
dad and you and your family.
Well, as I said, my family name is very important to me, and all my children and their children and my grandchildren. And this stain has to be addressed and rectified and justice done. And part of justice being done is, slavery was outlawed in 1865. And there's talk of restitution for blacks and Japanese Americans have been given restitution. But what happened to my father and many other men who were worked without pay, tortured, beaten, drugged, and abused in unspeakable ways, and their free labor put food on the table of many of those politicians and people were looking the other way because they felt, well, I can feed my family, and if that institution stays in place, so be it. And these quote unquote inmates would just have to be thrown under the bus, and what was done to them was done to them. Now, the media in that area was complicit. They knew what was going on. A lot of the guards knew what was going on, people in the community. But as long as the money rolled in, the funding and the free labor from these poor, unfortunate men who rarely ever saw home again, well, so be it. Well, this needs to be addressed. And if restitution can be given Japanese Americans and considered to be given to black Americans for slavery, then restitution should be available to the offspring who suffered. I suffered immensely as growing up without my father, being stained by what was falsely done to him, and my children are stained. And in the same way, indirectly, we should not be ashamed of the last name Fanala. There's no reason in the world this has to go on and on. This record needs to be expunged, and there needs to be restitution made in many ways, not only a recognition of the atrocities that were done to not only my father, but to other men in that place that the men called it hell on earth or Auschwitz, and it truly was hell on earth. So I think that is fair. I think that's just.
Yeah.
I think when there's an injustice of this magnitude, it has to be addressed. The people have to be held accountable. The state that was complicit of Pennsylvania, and in every way, this has to be put on the table. All the cards have to be put on the table and find out exactly what I asked for when I went to see my father at age 27. I made a special trip to see him, and what I found shocked me. It was a little more than a zombie, and I couldn't even hold an intelligent conversation. When I addressed this with the administrator, they turned their back on me, and I said, I want a copy of all the records, what was done to my father. And they refused to even look at me as a
Oh,
man.
wow.
And this is totally unacceptable.
Oh,
This kind of behavior by administrators in a so-called state institution, and what was done to him to turn him into virtually a zombie. I need to have the records, complete records of what was done to George Stephen Fanala for all the years that he spent in the custody of the Fairview Mental Hospital for the criminally insane. The term even makes me gag because it's such a joke. It would have fit
it's
more
sick.
into something out of the Third
It's
Reich.
sick.
And then,
Yeah, it
all
is.
right,
It is. This is exactly the same guidelines and protocol of an internment camp. What you're saying is so important today because we were watching some news stories that I think the greatest fear is internment of any human being and treating them like in slavery of any kind. Go ahead and tell us about what your journey is going to be when you talk to the Justice Department like you did today. We got the paperwork started, and that's
well,
one of the things we wanted to accomplish by this interview is exposing the corruption that happened not only at the state hospitals in Pennsylvania and probably throughout United States possibly. This this isn't just a one-time thing. They didn't even look you in the eye, is what you
right,
said. And what I wanted
exactly.
you to tell us about is go into how it, once exposing the corruption, how you get compensated in your family, because that's a what happened to your dad is what by today's standards is called a crime assistance in Pennsylvania. Back then,
Exactly.
your dad basically had a bad relationship with your mother. Your mother was a psych nurse and she worked it out that your dad was sent away so that you would not have a father. It's basically what happened to you. And you basically ended up at the Holy Family Institute where you got abused as a little boy. And
That's right.
we've been exposing this on my radio channel for a while. In fact, exposing other programs, and we're going to get into the corruption of how much millions of dollars and how many people benefited and looked the other way, as you put it. So,
Correct. This is when you lay all the cards on the table, it creates quite a big story with a lot of tentacles, and the tentacles reach deep into generations. Whenever an injustice of this magnitude is perpetrated on a person, you can look for rippling effects for 100 years or more on their children and their children's children. And this is what happens. Now, if all this can be understood with black slaves, there's a lot of sensitivity sessions going on about the effects of slavery, then it should easily be understood in this case that whenever this was done to my father, this was not just done to him. What was done to him was done to me. As you mentioned, I was put in an orphanage where that's another story of horrible abuse. And then on top of that, I was told that I was a loser, a born loser. I was going to end up the same way. All my life, all I heard was I was a failure, a born failure, or a son of a convict. Not just a convict, but a convict in a prison for the criminally insane. Can you imagine growing up as a young boy with no brothers, no sisters, effectively no father, no mother, effectively, and being told daily almost by everybody around you that you're a loser or it's in your genes and you're going to end up in prison or worse and you'll never amount to anything and so on, and having that kind of message pounded into your head every day, and in spite of that, to go to Penn State University and succeed in getting an electrical engineering degree, working as an electrical engineer for my career for this country as an engineer, and contributing and producing 4 wonderful children who are also contributing to the United States. That's all in spite of what was done to my father and me. So yes, I do think those cards need to be put on the table, and just people need to be held accountable. The state of Pennsylvania needs to be held accountable,
Yeah.
and there should be some consideration for compensation for what was done to me and my
George,
family.
we were sharing this story and we're going into the second half of the part two of this interview. And if you want to hear more about George's story, we may do a part three. I don't know. I think we should take as much time as we can at this. I wanted to tell you that I grew up the same way as George. I was told I wasn't going to amount to anything. In fact, aunt, George's mother is just like other relatives in my family who have done this exact same thing. And I think there's a history there. In fact, it's recorded in children's services and children and family services. It went as far as the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services, to be honest with you, George, because
Yeah.
what happens
Yeah.
what happens
Can
is
I say something, Jennifer?
yes, go ahead, George.
Well, one thing that comes out clearly is in states where there is not a corrupt media and corrupt politicians, you don't have this taking place in other states. Why? And there has to be a fertile ground for this to happen, and it has to involve a number of factors. Basically, media that looks the other way, greedy, self-serving politicians, a unenlightened public that refuses to see what is going on. When you go to other states, to the Midwest, you don't find this kind of thing, the history of this kind of thing, as much as you found in Pennsylvania. Nothing this atrocious, because they have a good independent media that would expose this immediately. They don't have as much corruption. So the state of Pennsylvania should be ashamed of itself for allowing an environment in that part of Wayne County, those politicians that allowed this to go on for decades to serve their own interests, the people they threw under the bus.
Well, that's
just so they could fatten their own. I mean, some of these psychiatrists never even saw their patients, and they lived on paid-for estates like manors on that compound. I mean, they had compensation packages that were amazing, and they never even attended medically or psychiatrically to these men. And that's a matter of record. You can look it up. And they didn't do their job, but they lived like little kings.
Yeah, that's it.
On paid housing. I mean, the story goes on and on and on as you dig into it about utter greed and corruption and people looking the other way in the state of Pennsylvania. Now, I grew up in Pennsylvania. I went to Penn State, but this is a stain not only on my family unjustifiably, but it's a stain on the entire state of Pennsylvania and its history for allowing, because other states can proudly say they did not have atrocities like this taking place in their states. Now, why is it that in Pennsylvania this is going on, in other states it was not going on? Well, a big part of it is a good, solid, can-do, will-do media exposing it. It would have never happened if the papers in that area would have exposed and written stories constantly about what horrors were going on in that far view, institution for the criminally insane. That whole thing would have been busted up. But they played right along, apparently.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more than just the media. I think everybody's accountable to some extent. That what you said earlier is that no one got out of that place without coming out on a quote slab, and that's horrific. That's horrific that humanity would go.
Very few were released, got out of there, unless they were worked to death. By the time they allowed my father to go to the Veterans Hospital, they had already worked him mostly to death, and he didn't last much longer.
Can you go back to what you were saying about what happened when you were up there, and when we expose corruption, we're exposing the corruption of the whole system. It ended up at the Department of Human Services And in this investigation and interview, it would take years for Pennsylvania to compensate, um, to find all the victims and
The
families. Like your
survivors of
your
all
your children were victims of this because
yes,
of what
the
happened to
victims.
you.
Because of what they did to my father. They made victims of me and my children, and so on.
Yeah.
You know, the rippling effects were immense.
Oh yeah.
I mean, because I was looked down upon within our family as being a black sheep, you might say, a loser, the son of not only a convict, but a man who was criminally insane. So you can imagine how I was treated, even within my own family.
How many of your relatives knew about this, George?
Oh, everybody knew about it. It was all over the neighborhood. Kids used to tease me about it. Everybody knew where George ended up. His family had to make up stories that he was dead. They were so ashamed. These were immigrants from Austria, and they were so ashamed that they stopped visiting him and were telling people that he was dead. Now, can you imagine how pain of a mother and a father having to tell a story falsely that their firstborn son was dead because of the shame and the neighborhood of him being in an institution for the criminally insane?
Okay, we're gonna end it. We're gonna end the interview here because we're at the end of part 2. Do you, George, want to say something here? You got about 5 seconds. Do you want to go into part 3 about what your family went through? Okay.
I want to say one thing. There's an old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that really describes Farview. It started out with glorious intentions and ended up to be a pure hellhole. So the road to hell is paved. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I want our audience to remember that when a politician, a businessman, or any kind of a leader starts to paint a rosy picture about an institution or an idea or this or that, be very careful that that thing doesn't end up to being hell on earth, a nightmare, and Auschwitz in your very midst. We fought World War II because of Auschwitz and what the Japanese did to our soldiers, the Bataan Death March, and we ended up, sadly to say, creating an Auschwitz right there in Wayne County,
right there,
called that horrible institution called Farview Hospital for the Criminally Insane. That would have fit perfectly into the Third Reich.
Right.
Didn't belong.
We're gonna leave it right there. We're gonna leave it right there. Okay, we're gonna do part 3. I want to thank you, George, for doing this interview because I want to wrap it up here. What you heard is what we lived through, what we survived here in Pennsylvania, and as crime victims and survivors. When I did Survivors Post, firsthand what George and I had grown up around, and it is a crime against humanity. What happened to George, what happened to my family, what happened to me. We want you guys to listen to part 3 coming up next.